The hangar door slid open with a long metallic groan, and the desert wind carried dust across the polished concrete floor like a slow grey tide. 23 men in plate carriers and faded fatigues stood in a loose half-circle, waiting for the briefing officer who would lead them into the mountains before dawn. None of them noticed the woman standing near the fuel drums in the far corner, wearing no patch, no rank tab, no name tape, only a clean olive shirt, faded trousers, and worn brown boots that had seen more countries than most of them could name. Commander Reed Holloway, a SEAL Team 6 veteran with 18 years in the naval special warfare community, walked in expecting to meet a translator or a low-level analyst. He had been told only that a specialist would join the team for one mission and that he should not ask her name. He had laughed at that in the truck on the way over. He was not laughing now. When the woman turned, the overhead light caught her face, and Holloway felt something in his chest go very still. He did not know her. He had never seen her before. But the way she stood, the way her hands rested loosely at her sides, the calm in her eyes that had nothing left to prove, told him everything he needed to understand in a single breath. Without thinking, without a single order being given, Commander Reed Holloway straightened his spine, lifted his right hand, and saluted her. His men froze. The hangar went silent. 23 of the most dangerous operators in the United States military watched their commander salute a woman with no badge, no rank, and no name. Who was she, and what had she done to earn a salute that no manual could explain? Would you have recognized her too? Her name was Elizabeth Caro, though almost no one in the building was authorized to know that. Most of her career had been spent under other names, in other clothes, in places that did not exist on official maps. She was 36 years old, 5 feet 7 inches tall, with pale blue eyes that always seemed to be measuring something. And sandy blonde hair she kept cut just above the shoulders so it could be tied back in less than 4 seconds. She did not look like a legend. She looked like a quiet woman who had slept badly for a long time. Elizabeth had grown up on a small dairy farm outside Bozeman, Montana, the only daughter of a Marine Corps veteran who had come home from Beirut with a limp and a habit of staring at the horizon. He had taught her how to shoot before she could ride a bicycle, how to read tracts in the snow before she could read books, and how to hold her temper when the boys at school called her father broken. She had loved her father more than anything, and when he died of a heart attack the summer she turned 17, she signed her enlistment papers 2 weeks later. She had wanted to be a Marine like him. The recruiter, an honest staff sergeant with kind eyes, had looked at her test scores and gently suggested the Army instead. Within a year she was wearing a paratrooper's wings and a uniform that did not yet feel like her own. Within 3 years she was leading a small intelligence cell in northern Iraq, translating intercepted radio chatter while mortars walked across the base behind her. The men in her unit had not always trusted her at first. She was younger than most, quieter than all of them, and she had a habit of correcting the senior analysts when their conclusions did not match the evidence. They learned, slowly, that she was almost always right. They learned faster after the night she predicted an ambush on a supply convoy for hours before it happened, and the convoy commander, against his better judgment, listened. 17 men came home alive that night who would not have come home otherwise. That was the night someone in Washington wrote her name on a list they kept in a locked drawer. She did not know about the list. She only knew that 2 months later she was offered a transfer she could not discuss, to a unit she could not name, for a job that would change everything about who she was allowed to be in public. She said yes because her father had taught her that when your country asks you to stand somewhere difficult, you stand there until you are relieved. She had been standing there for 14 years. The unit she joined did not have a flashy name or a recognizable patch. It existed inside the long shadow between military intelligence and the special operations community, the kind of organization that borrowed people from the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marine Corps and then quietly forgot to give them back. Their job was simple to describe and almost impossible to do. They went into places where conventional units could not go, gathered information that satellites could not see, and prepared the ground for the operators who would arrive later with rifles and helicopters. Elizabeth was sent to a training compound in the high desert of Nevada, where the wind never stopped and the instructors never smiled. For the first 8 months she did not see her own reflection in a mirror more than twice a week. She learned 5 languages well enough to argue in them, for dialects of Arabic well enough to be mistaken for a local, and 2 Central Asian languages well enough to buy bread without raising suspicion. She learned to drive a manual transmission truck through mountain switchbacks at night without headlights. She learned to disappear inside a crowd of 3 people. She also learned how to be hurt. The hand-to-hand instructor, a retired Delta operator named Wexler with grey hair and a broken nose that had never been set properly, took one look at her on the first day and said she would quit within a week. She did not quit. She lost almost every fight for the first 3 months. She came back every morning with bruises on her ribs and ice on her jaw, and she watched him, and she studied him. And on the 94th day she swept his legs out from under him and pinned his shoulder to the mat for a full count. Wexler stood up, brushed the dust from his shirt, and said only one word. He said, "Finally." Then he taught her the rest of what he knew. There were other women in the program, though never many at the same time. Elizabeth became close to one of them, a former Air Force pararescue officer named Marin Halsey, who had blonde hair like hers and a laugh that could fill a quiet room. They studied together, ran together, and shared the same small wooden bunk room for 2 years. When Marin was killed in a helicopter crash in the Hindu Kush during her second deployment, Elizabeth was the one who flew home with the casket. She did not cry at the funeral. She cried in the parking lot afterward, alone, with her hand pressed flat against the cold metal door of a rental car. After Marin, Elizabeth stopped making close friends inside the unit. She still cared about the people she worked with. She still risked her life for them without hesitation. But she kept a small, careful distance between herself and the world, the way a sniper keeps a careful distance between the muzzle of her rifle and the wall of the hide. By the time Commander Holloway saw her in that hangar, she had completed 41 operational deployments. She had been wounded 3 times. She had been declared dead once, by mistake, in a classified report that was corrected 48 hours later. And she had never, in 14 years, worn a name tape in the field. The mission that brought her to Holloway's hangar began 6 weeks earlier, in a cramped briefing room beneath a building in Northern Virginia that pretended to be an insurance company. A senior intelligence officer named Caroline Vance, a slim woman in her late 50s with silver hair and a habit of speaking very softly, slid a folder across the table and watched Elizabeth read it. A weapon scientist had defected from a hostile foreign program. He was hiding in a mountain village in a country that the United States was not technically operating in. He had information that could save thousands of lives if it reached the right hands, and he would be dead within 2 weeks if no one came for him. The terrain was brutal. The political situation was worse. A SEAL element would handle the extraction, but the team needed someone on the ground first. Someone who could walk into that village, confirm the man was who he claimed to be, confirm he was not bait for an ambush, and guide the team in without being noticed. Elizabeth read the folder twice. She asked 3 questions. She accepted the assignment. She traveled alone for the first leg, moving through 4 countries on 4 different passports, none of which carried her real name. By the time she reached the staging base in the region, she had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 9 days. She did not complain. She did not mention it. She simply drank black coffee, studied the satellite imagery, and memorized the names of every man, woman, and child in the village she was about to enter. She spent 11 days on the ground before Holloway's team was even briefed. She lived in a small mud-walled room above a goat pen, wearing a long dark dress and a head covering, speaking the local dialect with a careful accent. She confirmed the scientist was real. She confirmed he was sick, frightened, and telling the truth. She mapped every footpath in and out of the village, every house that might shelter watchers, every place a sniper could hide. She did all of this without sending more than 4 short-coded messages, because every transmission was a risk, and risks in that valley were paid for in lives. On the 12th day, she left the village on foot at 3 in the morning, walked 19 kilometers across a mountain pass with a small pack and a worn rifle she had buried weeks earlier, and reached an extraction point where a battered pickup truck was waiting for her. The driver, a local man whose brother had been killed by the same regime the scientist was fleeing, did not ask her name. He drove her to the staging base in silence. When she stepped out of the truck, the sun was rising behind her, and her boots were the color of the road. That was the morning she walked into the hangar where Commander Holloway was waiting. Holloway lowered his salute slowly, the way a man lowers a flag he respects. His men had still not moved. Petty Officer First Class Ryan Becker, the team's lead breacher, was the first to speak, and he spoke in a whisper that carried farther than he intended. "Sir," Becker said, "who is that?" Holloway did not answer right away. He walked across the hangar floor, his boots loud in the silence, and stopped 3 paces from Elizabeth. He had served with the best of the best for almost 2 decades. He had stood next to admirals, generals, and men whose names were quietly spoken in the dark corners of the building in Langley. He had also, once, 10 years earlier, been pinned down in a compound in a country he could not name, watching his element bleed out around him, certain he was about to die. A voice on the radio that night had talked him through a corridor of fire and out the other side. The voice had belonged to a woman he had never met, an analyst he knew only by her call sign. The call sign was Juniper. He had spent 10 years wondering what Juniper looked like. He had spent 10 years promising himself that if he ever met her, he would thank her properly. He looked at Elizabeth now and saw the calm in her eyes, the steady weight of someone who had carried other people's lives in her hands for a very long time. He did not need to ask. He knew. Holloway said quietly, "It's an honor." Elizabeth nodded once. She did not smile, but something softened at the corner of her mouth. "Commander," she said. Her voice was lower than the men expected, and steadier. "We have a lot of ground to cover." She walked to the briefing table at the center of the hangar, unrolled a hand-drawn map she had carried out of the mountains in a folded square of oilcloth, and began to speak. She did not raise her voice. She did not use jargon to impress anyone. She described the village, the routes, the watchers, the wind patterns at dusk, the way the dogs in the lower quarter barked at strangers but not at children. The way the elder in the third house from the well kept a loaded rifle behind a curtain that had not been washed in years. She described the scientist, the medication he needed, the names of his 2 daughters, and the small wooden carving of a horse he kept in his pocket because it had belonged to his dead son. The SEALs listened. They had been briefed by hundreds of people in their careers. They had never been briefed by anyone like this. Becker, who had a reputation for interrupting, did not interrupt once. The team medic, a quiet senior chief named Thorne, wrote down every word. When she finished, Holloway looked around the hangar at his men, at their faces, at the way their shoulders had shifted from skepticism to something close to reverence. He spoke softly. "We move at 2200, he said. "She walks point with me. No one questions her. No one slows her down. If she tells you to stop, you stop. If she tells you to run, you run. Is that understood?" 23 voices answered as one. The insertion went almost exactly the way Elizabeth said it would. 2 helicopters dropped them in a dry riverbed 11 kilometers from the village, low and fast, the rotors leaving a faint smear of dust against the cold black sky. The team moved in a long quiet line, their night vision green and steady, their boots finding the ground she had walked 12 days earlier. She led them along a goat path that did not appear on any map, around the ridge that the satellites could not see behind, and down into the dry creek bed that ran past the lower edge of the village. The plan was simple. Elizabeth would enter the village alone, retrieve the scientist and his daughters from the house above the goat pen, and bring them to a small stone wall at the edge of the orchard. Holloway and his men would hold an outer cordon. If everything went well, they would be in the air again before the village dogs finished barking. Everything did not go well. At 11 minutes past 3 in the morning, as Elizabeth was guiding the scientist's older daughter down the narrow stairs of the mud house, a vehicle she had not expected. A battered white pickup with no headlights rolled into the upper square of the village. 6 armed men stepped out. They were not local. They wore the dark clothes and the disciplined movements of a paramilitary unit, and they were carrying weapons that did not belong in that valley. Someone had talked. Somewhere along the chain, a leak had reached the wrong ears, and the regime had sent a team to make sure the scientists never left the mountains alive. Elizabeth heard the truck before she saw it. She felt the change in the air the way an animal feels a storm. She pressed the scientist and his daughters flat against the wall of the staircase and keyed her radio twice, the soft double click that meant contact, hold. Outside, in the orchard, Holloway froze. His men froze with him. 23 rifles came up slowly in the dark. What Elizabeth did next was not in any manual. She handed the scientist's younger daughter, a girl of 9, to her older sister. She pressed her own pistol into the scientist's shaking hand and told him, in his own language, that she would come back for them. Then she walked out of the house alone, into the upper square, in her dark dress and her head covering, and she became, for the next 4 minutes, a frightened village woman who had heard a noise. She approached the paramilitary team with her hands visible and her eyes lowered. She spoke in the local dialect, asking in a trembling voice whether her goat had wandered into the square. She moved closer, step by careful step, the way a woman who is no threat to anyone moves. The leader of the team, a heavy man with a thick beard and impatient eyes, waved her away with one hand and turned to give an order to his men. He never finished the order. What happened in the upper square of that village took less than 14 seconds, and most of the men in Holloway's team, watching through their night vision from the orchard below, would never speak about it in detail again. Elizabeth moved the way water moves when a stone is dropped into it, fast and certain and almost silent. She took the leader's sidearm from his belt before he understood what her hand was doing. She used the truck itself as cover. She did not fire wildly. She fired 4 times, each shot deliberate, each shot necessary, and when the last of the 6 men fell, she was already keying her radio with her free hand. "Move," she said. Just that one word. Holloway's team came out of the orchard like a single living thing. They flowed up the narrow streets, through the doorways she had mapped, around the dogs she had told them about. 2 men collected the scientist and his daughters from the staircase. 2 more carried the small bundle of papers and hard drives the scientist had hidden under the floor. Becca and the medic moved to Elizabeth, because she was bleeding from her left arm, though she had not mentioned it on the radio and would not mention it now. Becca said quietly as Thorne pressed a bandage against the wound, "We need to move." "I know," she said. Her voice was the same as it had been in the hangar. Steady. Low. A little tired. "Take them out first." "I will follow." "No, Holloway said." He had come up beside her without her hearing him, which almost no one ever managed to do. "We leave together." "That is not a discussion." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she nodded. They moved down through the village in the dark, 11 kilometers back to the dry riverbed where the helicopters would meet them. The scientist's younger daughter, the 9-year-old, walked the last 3 kilometers holding Elizabeth's hand, her small fingers wrapped tight around 2 of Elizabeth's. The way a child holds the hand of someone she has decided to trust forever. Elizabeth did not let go, even when her arm began to throb under the bandage, even when the cold made her shoulder stiffen, even when the wind on the ridge bit through her thin dress. The helicopters came in low and fast just before dawn. The team loaded the scientist and his daughters first, then the equipment, then the wounded. Elizabeth was the last person to climb aboard, the way she had been the first person to walk into the valley. As the rotors lifted them away, the scientist looked at her across the dim red interior of the aircraft, and he said something to her in his own language that none of the SEALs understood. Elizabeth answered him in the same language, very softly. He bowed his head. Later, Becca asked her what the scientist had said. "He said thank you for his daughters," Elizabeth answered. "He said he would tell them, when they were older, that the woman who came for them in the dark had no name." She looked out the small window of the helicopter at the mountains turning gold in the sunrise, and for the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself to close her eyes. The mission was never written about. There was no press release, no medal ceremony on a sunlit parade ground, no photograph in a newspaper. The scientist and his daughters were resettled under quiet names in a quiet country, and the information he carried saved more lives than anyone in that hangar would ever be allowed to count. Commander Reed Holloway returned to his team, completed 2 more deployments, and retired 3 years later as one of the most decorated officers in the history of naval special warfare. He kept, in a small wooden box on the shelf above his desk, a folded square of oilcloth with a hand-drawn map on it, and he never told anyone where it came from. Elizabeth Carroll went back to the work she had always done. There were other villages, other valleys, other passports, other nights spent walking alone under cold stars. She never wore a name tape in the field. She never asked for one. The list in the locked drawer in Washington grew a little longer next to her name, and the people who were allowed to read that list spoke of her, when they spoke of her at all, in the same careful voice that pilots use when they speak of whether they have only barely survived. Her story matters, even though almost no one will ever hear it, because it tells the truth about a kind of courage that does not need an audience to exist. Elizabeth was not a superhero. She was a farm girl from Montana who lost her father young, who said yes when her country asked her to stand somewhere difficult, who learned languages and tradecraft and patience and pain. Who lost a friend in the Hindu Kush and kept walking, who held a frightened child's hand across 3 cold kilometers of mountain because that was the right thing to do. She was underestimated for almost every day of her career. She was underestimated by recruiters, by instructors, by senior officers, by the men in that hangar who saw a woman without a patch and assumed she was a translator. And every time she was underestimated, she answered not with anger, not with speeches, not with the kind of loud defiance that makes for easy stories. She answered with preparation, with discipline, with skill, and with the quiet, steady weight of having done the work, alone, in the dark, for years. That is why Commander Holloway saluted her in the hangar before a single word was spoken. He saluted her because true respect in the military, the kind that no manual can teach, is something you feel before you can explain it. He saluted her because he had finally met the voice that had once talked him out of a burning building. He saluted her because some women in uniform do not need badges or ranks or names to be recognized by those who understand what they have carried. If her story stays with you, remember this. Courage is not always loud. Strength is not always noticed at first. And sometimes the person standing quietly in the corner of the room, the one nobody bothered to introduce, is the one who has already walked through the worst of it, alone. So that the rest of us could come home.